Sometimes a single moment of desperation can change two lives forever. In the Dakota Territory of 1888, when the night train pulls into Blackbird Crossing, it carries more than passengers and freight. It carries a young woman running for her life. Rosemary Quinn stumbles onto the platform in a torn wedding dress, her wrists bearing the marks of rope burns, having just escaped from a brutal gunrunner who bought her as a mail-order bride, only to discover his true plans were far more sinister. Across that same platform stands Graham Calloway, a widowed rancher haunted by his own losses, collecting a shipment of prize stallions when fate puts him face to face with terror he recognizes all too well. The seven-seater ranch stretched across the high mesa like a promise kept to the prairie itself. Graham Calloway stood at the edge of his front porch, watching the last light of day paint the distant buttes in shades of amber and rust. The ranch had been in his family for 15 years now, carved from wilderness by his father's steady hands and sustained by Graham's own determination after the old man passed. 8,000 acres of rolling grassland, dotted with the dark shapes of Hereford cattle, and bordered by the meandering Cedar Creek that gave the spread its name. The main house, built from local sandstone and weathered pine, sat solid and welcoming beneath a grove of cottonwoods. 2 stories of practical comfort, with wide windows that caught the morning sun and a wraparound porch that offered shade during the brutal summer heat. Behind it, the barn and outbuildings formed a neat cluster, the bunkhouse where his cowhands slept, the smokehouse where Moses worked his magic with beef and venison, the blacksmith shop where Graham still spent hours working iron when his mind needed the rhythm of hammer on anvil. This was his world, his responsibility, his sanctuary. Yet standing there in the gathering dusk, Graham's fingers found the small locket that hung beneath his shirt, pressed against his heart. Inside, a photograph of Margaret smiled back at him whenever he dared to look, his wife of 3 years. Taken by fever in the terrible winter of '86, the guilt never left him. That knowing certainty that he should have done more, been faster, found a way to save her when the sickness came. "Brooding again, brother?" Clara's voice cut through his reverie. His sister emerged from the house, her riding skirts swishing as she settled beside him on the porch rail. At 17, Clara possessed their mother's auburn hair and their father's stubborn chin, along with a tongue sharp enough to cut glass when the mood struck her. She'd been barely 12 when Margaret died, and Graham sometimes wondered if his grief had stolen her childhood, forcing her to grow up too fast in a house shadowed by loss. "Just thinking," Graham replied, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd learned to measure his words carefully. "Moses says the cattle are restless. Tonight might be weather coming in." Clara snorted, a sound that would have scandalized their mother. "Moses says a lot of things. Yesterday he claimed the rooster's crow meant visitors were coming. Day before that, he read the future in coffee grounds." She studied her brother's profile in the fading light. "You're thinking about her again." It wasn't a question. Clara had inherited their mother's gift for reading faces, particularly Graham's. He didn't deny it. There was no point. Margaret had been Clara's friend too, the older sister she'd never had, and her death had left wounds in them, both that time had scarred over, but never fully healed. "She would have loved this evening," Graham said quietly. "The way the light catches the creek makes it look like molten gold." "She would have," Clara agreed, her voice softer now. "She would have also told you to stop carrying that locket like a millstone around your neck. Margaret never asked you to stop living, Graham. She asked you to keep living." Before Graham could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the yard. Moses Washington emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, his weathered face creased with concern. At 63, Moses had served as a Buffalo soldier for 20 years before a Comanche arrow through his leg ended his military career. He drifted west, working ranches and cattle drives until Graham's father hired him as cook. When the old man died, Moses had stayed on, becoming equal part chef, counselor, and guardian to the Calloway family. "Riders coming in hard," Moses announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd served under fire. 2 horses, pushing them pretty fierce. Graham stepped off the porch, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. Visitors. After dark usually meant trouble in this part of the territory. The Badlands north of Blackbird Crossing were home to more than their share of men who preferred darkness for their business. The riders materialized from the gloom. Jake Morrison and Tommy Reeves, 2 of his most trusted hands. Both men looked as if they'd been riding hard for hours, their faces grim beneath the brims of their dusty hats. Jake, a leathery veteran of 30 years on the range, swung down from his horse with the careful movements of a man whose joints had felt too many. "Hard winters." "Boss," Jake called out, his voice tight with controlled anger, "we got problems. Found sign of rustlers up near Devil's Canyon. Fresh tracks, maybe 8 or 10 horses. They took at least 20 head, maybe more." Graham felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with threats to his land, his livelihood, his people. Rustling was a hanging offense in Dakota Territory, but catching the thieves in the act was another matter entirely. The Badlands offered too many hiding places, too many escape routes for men who knew the country. "Any idea who?" Graham asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tommy Reeves spat into the dust, his young face twisted with disgust. "Tracks led north toward Spade's territory. Can't prove it was his boys, but who else would be bold enough to steal?" "From the 7-seater?" Eli Spade. The name hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Gunrunner, cattle rustler, and worse, a man who'd carved out his own little kingdom in the most desolate reaches of the territory. The law didn't reach far enough to touch Spade, and he was smart enough to keep his worst activities just beyond the jurisdiction of any honest marshal. Graham had crossed paths with Spade's gang twice before, both times ending in gunplay and bad blood. "We'll deal with it in the morning," Graham decided. "Put the horses up and get some supper." "Moses, can you—" "Already got stew on the stove," Moses interrupted with a slight smile. "Man doesn't feed cowboys for 15 years without learning to read the signs." As the hands led their horses toward the barn, Clara stepped closer to her. "Brother, this is getting worse, isn't it? The rustling." Graham nodded grimly. The attacks had been escalating for months. First, a few head here and there, then larger groups, bolder raids. It was as if someone was testing his defenses, probing for weaknesses. The thought made his blood run cold, especially with Clara and Moses depending on him for protection. "Maybe it's time to send word to Marshal Garrett in Rapid City," Clara suggested. He could. By the time Garrett got here, the trail would be cold and the cattle long gone, Graham replied. "No, this is something we'll have to handle ourselves." Clara's jaw tightened, a sure sign she was preparing for an argument. "Handle it how? You and 4 cowhands against Spade's entire gang?" "That's not handling it, Graham. That's suicide." "Then what would you have me do?" The words came out sharper than he'd intended, touched with the frustration that had been building for weeks. "Run? Abandon everything Father built, everything we've worked for? Pack up and head east like some defeated pilgrim?" "I'd have you use your head instead of your pride," Clara shot back, her own temper flaring. "There's no shame in asking for help when you're outnumbered and outgunned." Moses cleared his throat diplomatically. "Might be we're borrowing trouble before it finds us. Could be these rustlers are just opportunists taking advantage of the season. Cattle prices are up, and desperate men do desperate things." Graham wanted to believe that, but something in his gut told him otherwise. The raids felt too organized, too calculated. Someone was orchestrating this campaign against the 7-seater, and Graham had a sinking feeling it was only the beginning. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The three of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The night air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. This was home. Graham reflected not just the land or the buildings, but the people who shared it with him. Clara with her fierce loyalty and sharper tongue. Moses with his steady wisdom and gentle strength. Even the cowhands who trusted him to keep them safe and fed. He thought of Margaret's locket, warm against his chest, and her voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze. Keep living, Graham. Keep protecting what matters. We'll face whatever comes, he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet conviction that had seen him through 3 years of grief and 15 years of frontier life. We always have. Clara squeezed his arm, her anger already fading into concern. I know we will. Just promise me you won't try to face it alone. We're a family, Graham. Act like it. Moses nodded his agreement. The girl's right. Been through too much together to start doubting each other now. Graham looked at these two people who'd become his anchor in a world that seemed determined to test him at every turn. Clara, growing from girl to woman with a strength that sometimes frightened him. Moses, whose loyalty had never wavered despite offers from other ranches that would have paid him better wages. They were his family, his responsibility, his reason for getting up each morning to face whatever challenges the territory might throw at them. I promise, he said, and meant it. As they headed inside for supper, Graham took one last look at the darkening horizon. Somewhere out there, in the lawless badlands north of Blackbird Crossing, Eli Spade was planning his next move. Graham could feel it in his bones, the way old wounds ached before a storm. Trouble was coming to the 7-Cedar Ranch, and when it arrived, it would test everything he'd built, everything he believed in, everything he was willing to sacrifice to protect the people he loved. Inside the house, Clara's laughter mixed with Moses's gentle teasing as they prepared the evening meal. The sound warmed Graham's heart even as his mind raced with plans and contingencies. He'd learned long ago that a man could face almost anything if he had something worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to everything he held dear. But tonight, in the warm glow of the kitchen lamplight, surrounded by the people who'd chosen to stand with him, Graham Calloway allowed himself a moment of peace. He touched the locket one more time, whispered a prayer for strength and wisdom, and stepped into the light to join his family. The 7-Cedar Ranch had weathered storms before. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. The three of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The night air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. This was home. Graham reflected not just the land or the buildings, but the people who shared it with him. Clara with her fierce loyalty and sharper tongue. Moses with his steady wisdom and gentle strength. Even the cowhands who trusted him to keep them safe and fed. He thought of Margaret's locket, warm against his chest, and her voice seemed to whisper in the evening breeze. Keep living, Graham. Keep protecting what matters. We'll face whatever comes, he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet conviction that had seen him through 3 years of grief and 15 years of frontier life. We always have. Clara squeezed his arm, her anger already fading into concern. I know we will. Just promise me you won't try to face it alone. We're a family, Graham. Act like it. Moses nodded his agreement. The girl's right. Been through too much together to start doubting each other now. Graham looked at these two people who'd become his anchor in a world that seemed determined to test him at every turn. Clara, growing from girl to woman with a strength that sometimes frightened him. Moses, whose loyalty had never wavered despite offers from other ranches that would have paid him better wages. They were his family, his responsibility, his reason for getting up each morning to face whatever challenges the territory might throw at them. "I promise," he said, and meant it. As they headed inside for supper, Graham took one last look at the darkening horizon. Somewhere out there, in the lawless Badlands north of Blackbird Crossing, Eli Spade was planning his next move. Graham could feel it in his bones, the way old wounds ached before a storm. Trouble was coming to the seven-seater ranch, and when it arrived, it would test everything he'd built, everything he believed in, everything he was willing to sacrifice to protect the people he loved. Inside the house, Clara's laughter mixed with Moses's gentle teasing as they prepared the evening meal. The sound warmed Graham's heart even as his mind raced with plans and contingencies. He'd learned long ago that a man could face almost anything if he had something worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to everything he held dear. But tonight, in the warm glow of the kitchen lamplight, surrounded by the people who'd chosen to stand with him, Graham Calloway allowed himself a moment of peace. He touched the locket one more time, whispered a prayer for strength and wisdom, and stepped into the light to join his family. The seven-seater ranch had weathered storms before. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. The forged marriage certificate crackled in Rosie's trembling hands as she huddled beneath the freight tarps in Graham's wagon. The legal document that had sealed her fate bore an official seal from the Territorial Marriage Bureau, complete with elaborate flourishes and proper signatures, all of it expertly fabricated by the man who'd sold her like livestock. She'd discovered the truth only hours before her scheduled wedding to Eli Spade, when she'd overheard him discussing her real value with his lieutenant. "She's worth more than gold to the railroad syndicate," Spade had growled through the thin walls of the Blackbird Crossing Hotel. "They need someone who can read and write for their telegraph operations. Once I hand her over with the dynamite, they'll control communication for 300 miles of track." The memory made Rosie's stomach lurch as the wagon wheels found another rut in the road. She pressed her face against the rough canvas, trying to steady her breathing. The torn wedding dress, once white silk, now stained with coal dust and fierce sweat, caught on the wooden crates around her. The dress had cost more than her father made in 6 months at the St. Louis print shop, purchased with money that didn't exist for a marriage that was never meant to happen. Graham's voice drifted back from the driver's seat, low and reassuring, as he spoke to his horses. "Easy there, Thunder. I know the road's rough, but we need to keep moving." His tone carried the patience of a man accustomed to working with skittish animals, and somehow it helped calm Rosie's racing heart. She'd told him everything during those first, desperate minutes on the train platform, how her father's gambling debts had caught the attention of men who dealt in human cargo, how the marriage arrangement had seemed like salvation until she learned the truth. Graham had listened without judgment, his weathered face growing grimmer. With each revelation, before making the split-second decision that would change both their lives. "Ma'am," his voice came quietly now, "we're about 10 minutes from the ranch. You'll be safe there? I give you my word." Safe, the word felt foreign. After weeks of fear, Rosie clutched the marriage certificate tighter, this piece of paper that had nearly cost her everything. It was evidence of Spade's reach, his willingness to corrupt even legal institutions for his purposes. But it was also proof of his crimes. If she could find someone willing to act on it, the wagon lurched to a sudden stop, and Graham's voice changed, becoming sharp with tension. Well, looks like we've got company." Through a gap in the canvas, Rosie glimpsed riders emerging from the cottonwoods that lined the creek. 5 men, their faces shadowed beneath hat brims, hands resting casually on gun butts. Her blood turned to ice water as she recognized the leader, Dirk Malloy, Spade's most trusted enforcer, a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his skill with a knife. "Evening, Calloway," Malloy called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Mighty late to be hauling freight. don't you think? Graham's reply was steady, betraying nothing. Evening, Malloy. Just picking up supplies from the train. Nothing that concerns you or your boss. Malloy urged his horse closer, and Rosie could smell the man's unwashed scent even through the canvas. See? That's where you're wrong. We're looking for something that went missing from town tonight. Young woman, pretty little thing in a wedding dress. Don't suppose you've seen anything like that? Can't say I have, Graham replied. Been dealing with horse traders most of the evening. They're a gossipy bunch. If there'd been excitement in town, I'd have heard about it. Rosie held her breath as Malloy's horse circled the wagon. The man's spurs jingled with each step, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the prairie silence. She could hear him sniffing, like a hound following a scent trail. Funny thing, Malloy continued conversationally. Spade's real particular about his property. Gets downright violent when someone tries to steal from him. You understand what I'm saying, Calloway? I understand you're on my land without invitation, Graham replied, his voice hardening. And I understand you've got about 10 seconds to state your business or move along. The tension ratcheted higher. Rosie could practically feel the hands moving toward weapons, the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows between the crates, her fingers still clutching the marriage certificate. Now, Malloy said, his tone turning ugly. No need for hostilities. Just thought you might want to know someone's been taking liberties with Calloway. Cattle. Found fresh 7-seater brands up in Devil's Canyon yesterday. Mighty careless of you to let your herd wander so far north. Graham's silence stretched long enough to make Rosie's chest tight with held breath. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of controlled fury. If you're accusing me of something, Malloy, say it plain. Otherwise, get off my land. Not accusing, Malloy replied with mock innocence. Just sharing information between neighbors. Course, neighbors look out for each other, don't they? Help each other find lost property. The sound of leather creaking filled the air as men shifted in their saddles. Rosie realized they were surrounding the wagon, cutting off escape routes. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered Spade's promise. She'd die before dawn for humiliating me. I'll keep that in mind, Graham said finally. Now I've got work to do, and you've got somewhere else to be. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Malloy's laughter cut through the tension, harsh, humorless, full of implied threat. You always were too proud for your own good, Calloway. Pride's a dangerous thing in this territory. Gets good people hurt. Is that a threat, Malloy? Just friendly advice. The kind neighbors give each other. Malloy's horse pranced sideways, and Rosie caught a glimpse of his face in the moonlight angular, scarred, with eyes like chips of flint. You find anything interesting, you know where to reach us. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings. The riders melted back into the shadows as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving only the sound of retreating hoofbeats and Graham's controlled breathing. Rosie remained frozen beneath the tarps until his voice came, gentle and reassuring. They're gone now. We're almost home. The wagon resumed its journey, but the encounter had changed everything. Rosie understood now that Graham's decision to help her had painted a target on his back, his family, his entire way of life. The marriage certificate in her hands represented more than her own enslavement. It was evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the very foundations of territorial law. As the lights of 7-Seater Ranch appeared in the distance, warm and welcoming against the prairie darkness, Rosie made a silent vow. She wouldn't be just another victim to be rescued and protected. She had skills, knowledge, determination. If Eli Spade wanted a war over his lost property, she'd give him one, but not the kind he expected. The forged marriage certificate would be her weapon, and Graham Calloway's courage would be her shield. Together, they'd face whatever came or die trying. The inciting incident was complete. The chase had begun, and there would be no turning back for either of them. The 7-seater ranch house blazed with lamplight as Graham's wagon rolled into the yard, but Rosie remained hidden beneath the tarps until they reached the safety of the barn. The familiar sense of hay and leather filled her nostrils as Graham helped her down, his hands steady and respectful despite her torn dress and disheveled appearance. "Welcome to 7-seater," he said quietly, offering her his coat to wrap around her shoulders. "You're safe here." The barn doors opened to reveal a young woman with auburn hair and sharp green eyes, her riding skirt practical and well-worn. Behind her stood an older black man with kind features and the bearing of a soldier, his cook's apron dusted with flour. Both studied Rosie with curiosity tinged by wariness. "This is my sister Clara," Graham said, "and Moses Washington, who keeps us all fed and out of trouble." He turned to his companions. "This is Miss Rosemary Quinn. She's going to be staying with us for a while." Clara's eyes took in Rosie's torn dress, the rope burns on her wrists, the exhaustion written across her features. Her expression softened immediately. "Lord have mercy. What happened to you, child?" Before Rosie could answer, Moses stepped forward with a blanket. "Questions can wait. This young lady needs food, clean clothes, and a safe place to rest. Everything else will keep until morning." Graham nodded gratefully. "Moses is right. But first," he turned to Rosie, his expression serious. "Those men who stopped us, they weren't giving up. They'll be back, probably with more riders. I need you to tell me everything about Eli Spade and what he's planning." Rosie pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders, drawing strength from its warmth and the steady presence of these people who'd welcomed her without question. "Spade isn't just a gun runner," she began. "He's working with the railroad syndicate to control all telegraph communication across the Northern Territory. They need someone who can operate the equipment, someone who understands codes and ciphers." "That's where you come in," Clara said, her quick mind already grasping the implications. "I worked in my father's print shop in St. Louis," Rosie confirmed. "I know typography, telegraphs, even some basic bookkeeping. When the gambling debts came due, Spade's men presented the marriage arrangement as a business proposition. Father thought he was securing my future." Moses's weathered face hardened. "Instead, he was selling you into slavery." "The marriage certificate is forged," Rosie continued, pulling the document from her dress, "but it's good enough to fool most territorial officials. Spade's been using similar documents to acquire other women, other skills he needs for his operation." Graham examined the certificate, his jaw tightening as he read. "This is sophisticated work. Professional forger, probably working out of one of the bigger cities. Someone with access to official seals and proper paper stock." "There's more," Rosie said. "I overheard Spade talking about dynamite, about something happening to the railroad bridge. He mentioned controlling 300 miles of track." Clara sucked in a sharp breath. "The new bridge across Devil's Canyon. It's the only rail connection between the eastern settlements and the mining towns up north. If someone controlled that bridge, they'd control commerce for half the territory," Graham finished grimly. "Food, supplies, ore shipments, even mail delivery. It would be worth a fortune." Moses had been listening intently, his military experience evident in the way he processed tactical information. "So this Spade character wants to blow the bridge and position himself as the only alternative route for goods and communications. Classic choke point strategy." "But why take the risk of kidnapping women?" Clara asked. "Surely there are easier ways to find telegraph operators." Rosie's voice grew quiet. "Because legitimate operators ask questions, keep records, report to authorities. Captive women can be forced to work, threatened into silence, disposed of when they're no longer useful." She looked directly at Graham. "I won't be the first woman to disappear into Spade's operation, and I won't be the last unless someone stops him." The weight of her words settled over the group. Graham found himself thinking of Margaret, of how helpless he'd felt when the fever took her. Here was another woman in danger, but this time he had the chance to act, to make a difference. "We'll stop him," he said simply. "Whatever it takes." Clara stepped forward, her young face set with determination. "We'll help you fight back, Miss Quinn. That's what neighbors do." "Rosie," she corrected with a small smile. "If we're going to face this together, we should use first names." Moses nodded approvingly. "Rosie, it is. Now let's get you settled in the house. Tomorrow we can start planning how to deal with Mr. Spade and his ambitions." As they walked toward the house, Graham's mind was already working through defensive strategies. The ranch buildings formed a natural compound, with good sight lines and multiple escape routes. His military training from the Indian Wars would serve them well, but they'd be outnumbered and outgunned. The interior of the house welcomed them with warmth, and the lingering sense of Moses's cooking. Clara immediately began fussing over Rosie, offering her a clean dress and access to the washroom. The simple kindness brought tears, too. Rosie's eyes, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated as a person rather than property. "The spare room's upstairs," Clara explained. It was Graham's wife's sewing room. She would have wanted you to use it." Graham's hand instinctively moved to the locket beneath his shirt. Margaret would indeed have welcomed Rosie with open arms, would have fought alongside them against Spade's evil. The thought gave him strength. As Moses prepared a late supper, Graham walked to the window and studied the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Eli Spade was planning his next move. The man wouldn't give up easily. Too much was at stake, too. Much money and power on the line. But for the first time in 3 years, Graham felt something besides. Grief driving him forward. Purpose. The chance to protect someone who truly needed protection. To stand against injustice in a way that might actually matter. The cattle brand iron hanging by the fireplace caught his eye. The 7-seater mark that had been earned into stolen cattle, dragged north to Spade's territory as a provocation. The connection was clear now. Spade had been probing their defenses, testing their resolve, preparing for this moment when he'd need to silence anyone who threatened his plans. Graham smiled grimly. Eli Spade had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that kidnapping Rosie would be just another business transaction, another problem to be solved with violence and intimidation. Instead, he'd given Graham Calloway something worth fighting for. And that made all the difference. The war for 7-seater ranch was about to begin. Dawn broke clear and cold over the 7-seater ranch, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Rosie woke in the unfamiliar comfort of Margaret Calloway's former sewing room, surrounded by half-finished quilts and the ghost scent of lavender sachets. Clara had found her a simple brown dress that fit reasonably well, and for the first time in weeks, Rosie felt almost human again. The sound of voices drifted up from the kitchen, along with the rich aroma of coffee and bacon. She made her way downstairs to find the household already bustling with activity. Moses stood at the stove, orchestrating breakfast with military precision, while Clara sat at the kitchen table examining the forged marriage certificate through a magnifying glass. "Morning, Rosie," Clara said without looking up. "Come see this. Your father taught you well. I can barely tell this seal is fake." Rosie joined her at the table, accepting a cup of coffee from Moses with grateful hands. Father always said attention to detail was the difference between honest work and shoddy craftsmanship. I suppose the same principle applies to forgery. "That's exactly what I was thinking," Clara said excitedly. "If you can spot the differences between real and fake documents, you could help us identify other parts of Spade's operation." Graham entered from the front porch, his hair damp from washing at the pump. "Jake and Tommy are riding the eastern boundary this morning, looking for more sign of rustlers. Ben and Curtis are moving the main herd closer to the ranch buildings." He poured himself coffee and settled at the table. "How are you feeling, Rosie?" "Better, thank you, and grateful." She met his eyes directly. "I know what it cost you to help me last night." Malloy made his meaning clear enough. "Malloy's all bluster," Clara said dismissively. "He wouldn't dare attack the ranch directly." Graham's expression suggested otherwise. "Don't underestimate him, Clara. Or Spade. They've been probing our defenses for months with those cattle raids. Last night changed the stakes considerably." Moses set a plate of eggs and bacon before Rosie and settled into his own chair. "The way I see it, we've got two problems. First, keeping Miss Rosie safe from immediate pursuit. Second, dealing with whatever larger scheme this Spade character is planning." "They're connected," Rosie said, cutting into her eggs. "Spade needs me alive to operate the telegraph equipment, but he also needs to demonstrate that crossing him has consequences. He'll come for me, but he'll make an example of anyone who helped me escape." "Let him try," Clara said fiercely. "This is our home. We don't abandon family." The casual inclusion of Rosie in that word family brought an unexpected tightness to her throat. In less than 12 hours, these people had shown her more genuine care than she'd received in months. "There might be another way," Rosie said slowly, an idea forming. In the print shop, when customers disputed bills or contracts, Father sometimes said the best defense was a good offense. What if we turned Spade's own tactics against him? Graham leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean?" "The marriage certificate, the forged documents, they're evidence of fraud. But more than that, they show a pattern of criminal conspiracy involving territorial officials. If we could expose that conspiracy, we'd have the law on our side instead of running from it," Moses finished approvingly. "I like how this young lady thinks." Clara's eyes lit up. "But we'd need more evidence than just one marriage certificate. We'd need to prove the pattern, show it's not an isolated incident." "That's where the telegraph comes in," Rosie said, her excitement growing. "If I could access the telegraph office in Blackbird Crossing, I might be able to trace other messages, other transactions. Spade's operation is too big to run without leaving communication trails." Graham was already shaking his head. "Too dangerous. Spade's men will be watching the telegraph office, expecting exactly that kind of move." "Not if we create the right diversion," Rosie countered. "You said he's been stealing your cattle, using it to provoke you. What if we gave him what he's expecting, a direct confrontation that draws his attention away from town?" The kitchen fell silent as they considered the implications. Outside, the normal sounds of ranch life continued: cattle lowing, horses nickering, the distant calls of the cowhands beginning their daily work. It was a peaceful scene that belied the danger gathering around them. "Gets risky," Moses said. "Finally, but it might work. Divide his forces, make him choose between protecting his base and pursuing his immediate objectives." Clara stood and walked to the window, studying the horizon with the same intensity her brother often displayed. "There's something else to consider. The telegraph key in the office. It's a newer model, isn't it? The kind that can reach multiple destinations simultaneously?" Rosie nodded, catching Clara's line of thinking. "It can reach Rapid City, Deadwood, even Cheyenne if the atmospheric conditions are right." "Why?" "Because if we're going to expose Spade's conspiracy, we need to reach people who can act on the information. Territorial marshals, federal investigators, maybe even newspaper editors in the bigger cities." Graham's expression shifted from skepticism to grudging admiration. "You're talking about more than just clearing Rosie's name. You're talking about bringing down Spade's entire operation." "Why not?" Clara shot back. "He's been terrorizing this region for years, corrupting officials, stealing cattle, destroying lives. Someone needs to stand up to him." Moses chuckled, the sound warm with approval. "Your sister's got fire, Graham. Reminds me of certain cavalry officers I knew who couldn't leave well enough alone when they saw injustice." The comparison made Graham uncomfortable. His military service had ended badly, with good men dying because of decisions he'd made. But looking at Rosie's determined face, at Clara's fierce resolve, at Moses's steady confidence, he felt something stir that he'd thought was buried with Margaret. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the recognition that some fights were worth the risk. "All right," he said slowly. "But we do this smart. Careful planning, multiple contingencies, and nobody takes unnecessary risks." He looked directly at Rosie. "That includes you. You're not expendable, no matter what Spade taught you to believe." The quiet conviction in his voice made Rosie's chest tight with emotion. She'd spent so long being treated as property, as a problem to be solved or a resource to be exploited, that genuine concern felt almost foreign. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate, but meaning them absolutely as they began planning their counterattack against Eli Spade. None of them noticed the distant figure watching from the ridge above Cedar Creek. Dirk Malloy lowered his spyglass with a thin smile, satisfied with what he'd observed. The Calloways and their guest were planning something. Just as Spade had predicted, it was time to force their hand. The wooden trunk in Graham's bedroom hadn't been opened in 3 years. It sat beneath the window like a sleeping sentinel, its brass corners tarnished with age and neglect. Graham knelt beside it now, his fingers tracing the familiar initials, carved into the lid: GC, 7th Cavalry, Fort Robinson. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the remnants of another life. His officer's uniform, still bearing the smell of campfires and leather oil. Campaign maps from the Pine Ridge country, marked with notations in his careful hand, letters from commanding officers, commendations for service, and at the bottom, the military medals that represented both honor and haunting memory. Clara stood in the doorway, watching her brother's careful inventory. "I wondered when you'd open." "That again." "Seems like the right time," Graham replied, lifting out a leather-bound notebook filled with tactical sketches and strategic notes. "Moses was right yesterday. We need to think like soldiers if we're going to survive what's coming." "Tell me about it," Clara said, settling on the floor beside him. "The war, I mean." "You never talk about what happened out there." Graham's hands stilled on a faded photograph of his cavalry unit. Young faces stared back at him, men who trusted his leadership and paid the price for his mistakes. There's not much to say. We followed orders, tried to keep the peace, and sometimes good. People died for causes they didn't understand. But you learn things about fighting, about strategy. "I learned that battles are won or lost before the first shot is fired," Graham said slowly. "Preparation, positioning, understanding your enemy's weaknesses, those matter more than courage or superior firepower." He pulled out a detailed map of the Dakota Territory, its edges worn from constant handling. Red ink marked cavalry patrol routes, water sources, and strategic choke points throughout the region. Graham spread it on the floor between them, his finger tracing the familiar landmarks. "Spade's operation is based here," he said, pointing to the Badlands north of Blackbird Crossing. "Natural fortress, multiple escape routes, easy to defend, but it's also isolated, dependent on supply lines through these passes." Clara studied the map with growing understanding. If someone were to disrupt those supply lines, his whole operation would be vulnerable. The question is whether we have the resources and the skill to pull it off. Footsteps on the stairs announced Moses's arrival, followed by Rosie's lighter tread. They found Graham and Clara surrounded by military paraphernalia, deep in strategic discussion. "Planning a war?" Moses asked, though his tone suggested approval rather than concern. "Planning to survive one," Graham corrected. "Spade's not going to give up on Rosie, and he can't afford to let us expose his conspiracy. That means we're facing an enemy with superior numbers and nothing to lose." Rosie knelt beside the map, her practiced eye taking in the detailed markings. "This is beautiful work. The precision reminds me of the survey maps they use for railroad construction." "Railroad surveys," Moses repeated thoughtfully. Now there's an interesting connection. You said Spade's working with the railroad syndicate? According to what? I overheard, yes. They need the telegraph communications secured before they can move on the bridge project. Rosie traced the rail line with her finger. If the bridge at Devil's Canyon were destroyed, all northern traffic would have to detour through this route instead. Graham followed her gesture to a narrow pass marked in blue ink. Crow's Gap. Single track, steep grades, perfect choke point for controlling commerce, and perfect place for charging premium rates for passage, Clara added with growing excitement. It's not just about the telegraph equipment. It's about controlling an entire economic region. Moses nodded grimly. Big stakes mean desperate measures. This Spade character won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens his operation. Then we eliminate him first, Graham said with quiet finality. But we do it smart, using every advantage we can create. He pulled out another notebook, this one filled with sketches of defensive positions and tactical formations. During the Ghost Dance troubles, we learned that small, mobile forces could hold off much larger enemy groups if they chose their ground carefully and prepared proper fallback positions. The ranch buildings, Rosie said, understanding immediately. You're thinking of turning Seven-Cedar into a fortress. Temporary fortress, Graham corrected. The goal isn't to withstand a prolonged siege. It's to buy time for help to arrive and to make the cost of attacking us too high to justify. Clara pointed to the main house on Graham's sketch. The stone construction would stop most rifle fire, and the porch provides covered firing positions on 3 sides. The barn's even better, Moses added. Higher elevation, clear fields of fire, and multiple exit points if we need to relocate. Graham felt a familiar stirring in his chest, tactical excitement that had made him a successful cavalry officer before pride and politics destroyed his career. It could work, but we'd need advance warning of any attack, and we'd need to ensure we're not fighting alone. The telegraph, Rosie said firmly. If I can reach the right people, marshal support before Spade makes his move. No, Graham's response was immediate and non-negotiable. I won't have you walking into town alone, not with Malloy's men watching every street. Then don't send me alone, Rosie replied calmly. Send me with backup, create a distraction, or find another way to access the equipment. But don't abandon the one advantage we have over Spade. Moses cleared his throat diplomatically. Might be there's a middle ground here. The telegraph line runs past Henderson's farm, about 2 miles east. If the line were damaged, say by a fallen tree, a repair crew would need to access the equipment to restore service. Clara's eyes lit up with understanding. And if Miss Rosie happened to be part of that repair crew, she'd have legitimate access to the telegraph key without entering town, Graham finished. It's still risky, but more manageable than a direct assault on the telegraph office. Rosie smiled, the expression transforming her tired features. You're learning to think like a forger, Mr. Calloway. Create a plausible reason for being where you shouldn't be, and most people won't question your presence. The afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, illuminating the scattered maps and documents that represented their growing plan. Graham felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, the sense of shared purpose, of people working together toward a common goal. We'll need to move quickly, he said, beginning to pack the military materials. Spade's not patient, and every day we delay gives him time to strengthen his position. Or to strike first. Moses pointed out soberly. Clara stood and brushed dust from her skirt. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for him. As they prepared to rejoin the daily routine of ranch life, Graham caught Rosie's eye. The determination he saw there reminded him of Margaret's quiet strength, but also of something uniquely her own, a survivor's resilience tempered by genuine courage. We'll get through this, he promised her. Yes, she replied simply. We will. The military medals caught the afternoon light as Graham closed the trunk, their polished surfaces reflecting back years of honor and regret. This time, he vowed, the outcome would be different. This time, the people he cared about would survive the battle. The printing press types scattered across the kitchen table like tiny metal soldiers awaiting orders. Rosie had retrieved the portable type case from her traveling bag, one of the few possessions she'd managed to salvage from her flight from Spade. Now she arranged the letters with practiced efficiency, composing documents that would turn Eli Spade's own tactics against him. The key, she explained to her fascinated audience, is making the forgery solve a problem the reader already has. People want to believe good news, especially when it confirms their existing suspicions. Clara leaned closer, watching Rosie's nimble fingers select each piece of type. What kind of suspicions? That Spade's been cheating his business partners, Rosie replied, setting another line of text. According to what I overheard, he's working with multiple buyers for the same merchandise, the railroad syndicate, territorial officials, even some mining interests north. Each group thinks they have an exclusive arrangement. Graham paced behind them, his mind working through tactical implications. So you're going to tell each group that the others are planning to betray them? Not directly. That would be too obvious. Rosie paused in her work, holding up a partially completed document. This purports to be a message from the railroad syndicate to their contacts in Cheyenne, requesting additional security because they've learned of complications with their Dakota Territory operation. Moses examined the document with interest. How does that help us? Because Spade's other partners will intercept it, I'll make sure of that, and assume the railroad syndicate is planning to cut them out of the deal. Meanwhile, I'll create similar messages suggesting that the territorial officials are investigating the mining contracts, and that the mining interests are planning to expose the railroad conspiracy. Clara laughed with genuine delight. You're going to make them all suspicious of each other. More than suspicious, Rosie corrected. I'm going to make them actively work against each other, which will disrupt Spade's timeline and scatter his resources just when he needs them most concentrated. Graham stopped pacing, his expression thoughtful. It's clever, but it requires precise timing and flawless execution. If even one of these groups realizes the documents are fake, they'll unite against us instead of fighting each other, Rosie finished. I know, but the alternative is facing Spade's full strength with just the four of us, and whatever help we can summon from neighboring ranches. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the kitchen windows as Rosie continued her delicate work. Each piece of type had to be positioned perfectly, each line carefully justified to create the appearance of authentic bureaucratic correspondence. Graham found himself mesmerized by her concentration, the way her tongue touched her lower lip when she encountered a particularly challenging layout. You learned all this from your father? He asked. Father taught me the technical skills, Rosie replied without looking up. The creative applications I developed on my own, usually when customers tried to cheat us on payment or delivery terms. She glanced up with a rueful smile. Turns out those skills translate surprisingly well to more serious deceptions. Clara had been quietly studying the sample documents, her sharp mind grasping the subtleties of Rosie's strategy. These are good, she said finally, almost too good. Won't the recipients wonder how such sensitive information found its way to them? That's the beauty of it, Rosie explained. Each group will assume one of their rivals is trying to manipulate them, which actually reinforces the message rather than undermining it. Paranoid people see conspiracies everywhere, especially when there actually is a conspiracy to uncover. Moses nodded approvingly. You've got a devious mind, young lady. I respect that in a person. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their work. Graham moved to the window, his hand instinctively checking his sidearm. Jake and Tommy, coming in fast. The two cowhands burst into the kitchen moments later, their faces grim with urgency. Jake's weathered features were tight with controlled anger, while young Tommy looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Boss," Jake said without preamble, "we found something up at Devil's Canyon you need to see, and it ain't good. More rustling?" Graham asked. Worse. Tommy's voice cracked slightly. "Found Henderson's boy, Billy. He's dead, boss. Shot in the back." The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Rosie's hands stilled on the printing type, and Clara's face went pale. Moses set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Where?" Graham's voice carried the cold authority of his military days. "Near the old line shack, about a mile from Henderson's property. Looks like he was running from something or someone." Jake's jaw worked as he struggled with the next part. There was a message pinned to his shirt. Said anyone helping the Calloways would end up the same way. Rosie felt the blood drain from her face. Billy Henderson was barely 16, a boy who'd done nothing more than exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now he was dead because Spade wanted to send a message about the consequences of defying him. "This is my fault," she whispered. "That boy died because of me." "No," Graham said firmly, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. "That boy died because Eli Spade is a murderer who uses fear as a weapon. Don't you dare take responsibility for his evil." Clara stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We have to do something. We can't let him terrorize the entire valley." "We are doing something," Moses said quietly. "Miss Rosie's plan is solid, and it's our best chance of disrupting his operations before more innocents get hurt." But Graham was already shaking his head. "The timelines changed. Spade's escalating faster than we anticipated. If he's willing to murder children to make a point, he won't hesitate to attack the ranch directly." Rosie gathered the scattered, typed pieces with trembling hands, her mind racing through revised calculations. "Then we accelerate our own timeline. Get the forged documents distributed tonight, before Spade can consolidate his forces for a major assault." "Too dangerous," Graham protested. We agreed when we thought we had days to prepare," Rosie interrupted. "Billy Henderson proves we have hours, maybe less." She met his eyes steadily. "I won't hide behind these walls while more people die for my freedom." The argument that followed was brief but heated. Graham's protective instincts warred with his tactical judgment, while Clara and Moses found themselves caught between admiration for Rosie's courage and concern for her safety. In the end, it was young Tommy who provided the deciding factor. "Begging your pardon, boss," he said hesitantly, "but there's something else." We saw riders heading toward the Peterson place, maybe 8 or 10 of them. If they're following the same pattern. Graham closed his eyes, visualizing the scattered homesteads that dotted the valley. The Petersons had 3 young children and an elderly grandfather. If Spade was systematically targeting families who might support the Calloways, a death toll would be horrific. "All right," he said finally, "we do this tonight. But we do it smart, and we all come home alive." Rosie nodded, already calculating the logistics of document distribution and telegraph access. "I'll need to reach Henderson's place to use their telegraph line, then get these papers to the right people in town." "I'll take you," Clara said immediately. 2 riders are less suspicious than 1, and I know every back trail in the valley." "No," Graham's voice brooked no argument. "Clara stays here. Moses and I will handle the distribution, while Jake and Tommy take defensive positions." The debate that erupted nearly shattered their careful planning. Clara's fierce independence clashed with Graham's protective nature, while Rosie struggled to balance her own expertise against the legitimate concerns of the people risking their lives to help her. It was Moses who finally restored order with a simple observation. "We're fighting each other instead of the enemy," he said mildly. "Spade would be pleased to see us tear ourselves apart before he has to lift a finger." The rebuke stung because it was accurate. Graham forced himself to step back from his emotions and think tactically. "You're right. We plan this like a military. operation, with clear objectives and fallback positions. Over the next hour, they refined their strategy with meticulous care. Rosie would accompany Graham to ensure the forged documents were distributed correctly, while Clara and Moses fortified the ranch against possible attack. Jake and Tommy would serve as scouts and messengers, maintaining communication between the teams. As evening shadows lengthened across the valley, Rosie packed her printing supplies with the care of a soldier checking his weapons. Each piece of type was a bullet in their war against Spade's conspiracy. Each forged document, a strategic weapon designed to sow confusion and mistrust among their enemies. Second thoughts? Graham asked quietly, finding her standing alone on the porch. Third and fourth thoughts, she admitted. But Billy Henderson deserves justice, and the other families in this valley deserve protection. If my skills can provide both. Graham stepped closer, his presence solid and reassuring in the gathering darkness. Margaret used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear. She sounds like a wise woman. She was. She would have liked you, I think. Would have admired your determination to fight back instead of just survive. The intimacy of the moment surprised them both. Somewhere between planning strategy and preparing for battle, their relationship had shifted from protector and protected to something deeper, more equal. Rosie felt the change like warmth in her chest, dangerous and precious in equal measure. Graham, she began, and stopped, unsure how to voice what she was feeling. I know, he said simply. When this is over, we'll have time to figure out what comes next. But first, we finish what Spade started. The night ahead would test everything they'd planned, everything they'd hoped for. But standing there in the prairie darkness, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stand with her, Rosie felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of a future worth fighting for. The railroad surveyor's map lay spread across Moses's kitchen table like a revelation written in ink and careful measurements. Graham stared at the detailed drawings, his military mind racing to process the implications of what they'd discovered in Billy Henderson's saddlebags. The boy hadn't been running from Spade's men. He'd been carrying intelligence that would change everything. This can't be right, Clara whispered, tracing the proposed rail line with her finger. They're planning to build through the entire valley? Rosie studied the technical notations with growing horror. Her experience in her father's print shop had taught her to read survey documents, and what she saw here went far beyond anything she'd imagined. It's not just the Devil's Canyon Bridge, she said slowly. They're planning to reroute the entire northern rail system. The map showed a complex network of proposed tracks, depots, and infrastructure stretching across 3 territories. At the center of it all, like a spider in its web, sat the 7-Cedar Ranch and the surrounding valley. What Graham had thought was his isolated sanctuary was actually the keystone of a massive commercial development project. Moses pointed to a series of red markings near the ranch house. What do these symbols mean? Demolition points, Graham replied grimly, his cavalry training helping him interpret the military-style notations. They're planning to level everything: the ranch, the homesteads, even the town of Blackbird Crossing. The room fell silent as the magnitude of Spade's conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about kidnapping women for telegraph operations or stealing cattle for quick profit. This was about seizing control of an entire region, displacing hundreds of families, and establishing a transportation monopoly that would last for generations. The dynamite, Rosie said suddenly. Spade mentioned dynamite when he was talking about trading me to the syndicate. I thought he meant the bridge, but this, she gestured at the map, this would require enough explosives to reshape the landscape. Clara's face had gone white with understanding. That's why they've been testing our defenses with the cattle raids. They need to know how much resistance to expect when they begin the forced relocations. Graham felt a cold fury building in his chest, different from the protective anger he'd felt over Rosie's situation. This was the righteous wrath of a man who'd spent his life defending people's right to exist peacefully on their own land. How long have they been planning this? According to the dates on these surveys, Rosie replied, studying the technical notes, at least 2 years, maybe longer. She looked up, her eyes bright with sudden understanding. Graham, your wife's death, when did you say that happened? Winter of '86. Why? Rosie's hands trembled as she traced a notation in the map's margin. Because according to this, the first survey team was supposed to visit this area in the spring of '86. If they encountered unexpected resistance, if someone was asking too many questions, the implication hung in the air like poison. Grimes' face went deadly still as he processed what Rosie was suggesting. Margaret hadn't died of random frontier fever. She'd been murdered to eliminate a potential witness to the early stages of the conspiracy. The doctor who treated her, Graham said, his voice hollow with growing certainty. He was new to the territory, claimed to be traveling through when he heard about her illness. Left town the day after she died, said he was needed elsewhere. Moses closed his eyes with understanding. Poison disguised as medicine. It's been done before, especially when someone needs a death to look natural. Clara grabbed her brother's arm, feeling the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. Graham, you can't be certain. The fever was real. I remember how sick she was. Fever induced by controlled doses of poison, Rosie said quietly, her printing experience having exposed her to various chemical compounds. It would be easy enough to disguise, especially if the victim was already weakened by a genuine illness. The revelation recontextualized everything Graham thought he knew about his life. His isolated ranch wasn't a sanctuary, it was an obstacle to be removed. His wife's death wasn't random tragedy, it was calculated murder. His family's safety wasn't just threatened by current events, it had been under attack for years. There's more, Jake said from the doorway, where he'd been silently absorbing the conversation. That doctor, I remember him now, saw him talking to a man who matched Malloy's description outside the hotel the night before Mrs. Calloway took sick. The pieces of the conspiracy fell into place with sickening clarity. Spade hadn't stumbled upon Rosie's situation by accident. He'd been systematically identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities throughout the region for years. The cattle raids, the intimidation campaigns, even the corrupt marriage arrangements were all part of a carefully orchestrated plan to clear the valley for development. They killed Margaret to hurt you, Clara said, her voice thick with tears and rage. To make you isolated, grieving, easier to manipulate or remove when the time came. Graham's hand moved unconsciously to the locket beneath his shirt. All this time, he'd carried the guilt of failing to save his wife, when in truth he'd never had a chance. She'd been murdered by people who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their grand design. The other deaths, Rosie said suddenly. Billy Henderson, the families that moved away citing bad luck or failed crops, how many of those were actually murders disguised as misfortunes? Moses's military experience provided the grim answer. Probably most of them. It's a classic strategy for territorial acquisition make life so difficult and dangerous that people abandon their claims voluntarily, or eliminate them if they refuse to leave. The map seemed to pulse with malevolent energy as they stared at it. Every line represented displaced families. Every notation marked someone's home and livelihood scheduled for destruction. The scope of it was breathtaking in its cruelty and audacious in its ambition. We can't fight this alone, Clara said flatly. This isn't just about our ranch anymore. It's about the entire territory. No, Graham replied, his voice carrying a new hardness that his sister had never heard before. We can't fight it alone, but we're not alone. He pointed to scattered notations throughout the map, other ranches, other homesteads, other families who'd who'd been marked for removal. Every person in this valley has a stake in stopping this conspiracy. They just don't know it yet. Rosie felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. The forged documents, we can modify them to expose the real conspiracy instead of just creating confusion among Spade's partners. Evidence, Moses said approvingly. Turn this map into proof of the whole scheme. Get it to the right authorities before Spade realizes we have it. But first, Graham said, his tactical mind already working through the implications, we need to warn the other families. Give them a chance to defend themselves or evacuate before Spade accelerates his timeline. Clara stood up, her young face set with determination that reminded Graham powerfully of their father. Then we'd better get started. If this map is accurate, we've got maybe days before they begin the final phase of their operation. The plot twist had revealed the true scope of their enemy's ambitions, but it had also given them something equally valuable, a complete picture of Spade's strategy and resources. For the first time since this nightmare began, they had the intelligence. They needed to mount an effective resistance. Graham carefully folded the surveyor's map, treating it like the precious weapon it had become. Margaret's death would finally have justice. The valley's families would have warning. And Eli Spade would learn that some people couldn't be intimidated, bought, or murdered into submission. The war for the valley was about to begin in earnest, but now they knew exactly what they were fighting for, and exactly how much was at stake. The broken telegraph wire dangled from its pole like a severed lifeline, sparking intermittently in the pre-dawn darkness. Rosie knelt beneath it with her portable repair kit, her fingers working frantically to splice the connections while Graham and Moses maintained watch from opposite ends of the creek bridge. They'd cut the line themselves 3 hours earlier, creating the perfect excuse for an emergency repair crew to access the telegraph system. Almost finished, Rosie called softly, her voice barely audible over the wind that moaned through the canyon. Just need another minute to complete the circuit. The past 6 hours had been a whirlwind of desperate preparation and careful coordination. Using Billy Henderson's surveyor's map as evidence, they'd managed to warn 12 families throughout the valley, watching as the scope of Spade's conspiracy gradually dawned on neighbors who'd thought themselves safe in their isolated homesteads. The response had been immediate and fierce. No one was willing to abandon homes they'd built with their own hands to satisfy some distant corporation's greed. Those same families were scattered throughout the valley in carefully planned defensive positions, connected by a network of signal fires and mounted messengers that would allow rapid communication when Spade's forces finally moved. It was a fragile alliance born of necessity, but it was more support than Graham had dared hope for when this nightmare began. Contact, Moses whispered from his position near the bridge approach. Single rider coming in from the north. Graham squinted through the darkness, recognizing the familiar silhouette of Tommy Reeves pushing his horse hard along the creek trail. The young cowhand pulled up beside them with barely controlled urgency, his face grim in the starlight. "Boss," Tommy panted, "they're moving." Spotted at least 30 riders gathering near Devil's Canyon, all armed and carrying supplies for extended operations. "Jake's keeping watch, but he sent me to warn you. They'll be here by dawn." Rosie's hands never paused in their delicate work as she absorbed the implications. 30 riders meant Spade was committing the majority of his forces to this operation, probably hoping to crush any resistance quickly before word of the conspiracy could spread beyond the valley. "Any sign of the other groups?" Graham asked. "The railroad people? The territorial officials?" "That's the strange part," Tommy replied. Jake saw riders heading toward Blackbird Crossing from 3 different directions, but they weren't joining up with Spade's main force. Looked more like they were positioning to cut off escape routes. Moses nodded grimly. Smart tactics. Spades learned from the forged documents. He knows his partners might be planning to betray him, so he's taking precautions to prevent anyone from escaping to expose the conspiracy. Or he's planning to eliminate the witnesses himself, Graham said. His military experience providing darker possibilities. If he can't trust his partners anymore, the safest course is to ensure none of them survive to testify against him. The thought sent a chill through Rosie that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn cold. She'd created those forged documents to divide Spade's forces. But if her strategy had instead motivated him to accelerate his timeline and eliminate potential threats. There, she said, tightening the final connection. The line's repaired. I can send messages now? Graham checked his pocket watch in the faint starlight. We've got maybe 2 hours before full daylight. Can you reach everyone we need in that time? If the atmospheric conditions cooperate, Rosie replied, already keying the first message. I'll start with the territorial marshal in Rapid City and try to reach the federal authorities in Cheyenne. Her fingers flew over the telegraph key with practiced precision, tapping out coded messages that would expose Spade's conspiracy to officials who had the authority to act on the information. Each transmission felt like a prayer sent into the darkness, a desperate plea for justice to arrive. Before it was too late. The response came faster than she'd dared hope. A steady stream of acknowledgments from law enforcement agencies across the territory, all confirming receipt of her evidence and promising immediate action. But even the fastest response would take hours to organize and deploy, and Spade's forces would be at the ranch long before help could arrive. Done, she announced, disconnecting the equipment. Every major authority from here to Denver now knows about the conspiracy. Even if we don't survive the next few hours, Spade's operation is finished. Graham helped her pack the telegraph equipment, his mind already shifting to the immediate tactical situation. Tommy, ride back to Jake and tell him to fall back to the second observation post. When Spade's forces move, I want our scouts safely out of the way. Yes, sir. Tommy wheeled his horse around, then paused. Boss? The Peterson family sends their regards. They're holding position at Willow Creek with 8 rifles and enough ammunition to make Spade's boys think twice about heading south. The news brought a grim smile to Graham's face. The Petersons were good people, steady and reliable, exactly the kind of neighbors a man could count on when the situation turned desperate. If they were committed to the fight, others would be as well. As they made their way back towards Seven Cedar Ranch, the eastern horizon began to show the first faint hint of dawn. The familiar landscape looked different now, transformed from peaceful ranch country into a potential battleground, where every hill and creek bed could conceal either friend or enemy. Clara's going to be furious that we left her behind, Moses observed as they crested the final ridge before the ranch. Clara's going to be alive because we left her behind, Graham replied firmly. That's what matters. But as the ranch buildings came into view, illuminated by the warm glow of oil lamps in every window, Graham felt his confidence falter. His sister was many things, stubborn, intelligent, fiercely loyal, but she'd never faced the kind of violence that was coming with the sunrise. Neither had Moses, despite his military experience, nor any of the neighbors who'd volunteered to stand with them. Rosie seemed to sense his doubts. Second thoughts? Third and fourth thoughts, Graham admitted, unconsciously echoing her words from the previous evening. These are good people, Rosie. They don't deserve to die for my mistakes. Your mistakes? She stopped walking, forcing him to meet her eyes. Graham, none of this is your fault. You didn't kill Margaret. You didn't create Spade's conspiracy. And you didn't force anyone to stand and fight. People are here because they believe in something worth defending. Moses nodded his agreement. She's right, son. Been a lot of years since I had something worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Feels good to remember what that's like. The ranch house stood before them, like a beacon of warmth and safety in the growing light. But Graham knew that impression was an illusion. In a few hours, those welcoming windows would become firing positions. Those solid stone walls would be tested by bullets and possibly explosives. and the people inside would face the kind of violence that could shatter lives and destroy everything they'd worked to build. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I want you both to know that having you here, fighting alongside us, it means more than I can express." Rosie reached out and squeezed his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "We're family now, Graham. That's what family does. We stand together, no matter what." As they approached the house, Clara emerged from the kitchen door with a rifle in her hands and determination written across her face. Behind her came Jake and the other cowhands, all armed and ready for the battle that was coming with the dawn. "About time you got back," Clara called out, though her relief was evident despite the brave words. "Moses, I've got coffee and breakfast. Ready. We'll need our strength for what's coming." The next hour passed in final preparations and quiet conversation as they waited for Spade's attack. Weapons were checked and positioned, ammunition distributed, escape routes reviewed one final time. The atmosphere was tense, but not panicked. These were people who'd faced hardship before and found the strength to endure. As the sun finally broke the horizon, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Rosie stood at the kitchen window and marveled at the beauty of the land that so many people were willing to die to protect. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she knew she'd found something worth fighting for, something worth the risk of everything she had. The war for Seven Cedar Ranch was about to begin. The burning bridge timber groaned and cracked as flames devoured the canyon crossing, sending sparks cascading into the morning air like malevolent fireflies. From her position in the ranch house kitchen, Rosie watched in horror as Eli Spade's master stroke became clear by destroying the bridge. He'd cut off the primary escape route for anyone trying to flee the valley, while simultaneously eliminating the most direct path for outside reinforcements to reach them. "Clever bastard," Moses muttered from his firing position at the front window. "Traps us here while making sure we can't get help." The attack had begun at first light with the systematic precision of a military operation. Spade's riders had emerged from 3 directions simultaneously, the main force approaching from the north along the creek road, smaller groups moving to flank the ranch from east and west, and a demolition team striking the bridge to complete their tactical encirclement. Graham's voice cracked like a whip from the barn loft where he'd established his command position. "Clara, Moses, hold your fire until they reach the fence line. Don't waste ammunition on long shots." Rosie's hands flew over the telegraph key she'd managed to set up using wire run from the main house to the barn. The broken connection she'd repaired earlier was now their only link to the outside world, and she was using it to coordinate with the scattered families throughout the valley. "Peterson family reports 12 riders moving south toward Willow Creek," she called out. "Henderson Place is under observation, but no direct assault yet." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, punctuated by the occasional crack of rifle fire as Spade's scouts tested the ranch's defensive perimeter. Through the kitchen window, Rosie could see muzzle flashes in the tree line where the attacking force had taken cover, preparing for their final assault. "They're not charging," Clara observed from her position at the side window. "Why aren't they charging?" Graham's answer came back grim and certain. "Because they know about the reinforcements we called for. They're waiting for something, probably confirmation that their own backup has arrived." As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed across the valley, the distant rumble of wagon wheels and marching feet. Rosie's heart sank as she realized what it meant. Spade hadn't just brought his outlaw gang to this fight. He'd somehow acquired legitimate military support, probably through his connections with corrupt territorial officials. "Telegraph's getting interference," she reported, struggling to maintain her connection to the outside world. "Someone's jamming the signal." Moses swore under his breath. "Military equipment. They've got professional support, all right." The first wave of attackers emerged from the tree line with practiced coordination, using covering fire to advance in short rushes toward the ranch buildings. These weren't the typical outlaws Rosie had expected. They moved with military discipline, their assault carefully planned and expertly executed. Graham's rifle cracked from the barn loft, and one of the advancing figures stumbled and fell. "Make every shot count," he shouted. "They've got us outnumbered, but not outgunned." The battle escalated rapidly as both sides committed to the engagement. Bullets shattered windows and chipped stone walls, while the defenders' return fire forced the attackers to take cover behind fence posts and farm equipment. The carefully maintained order of the ranch yard dissolved into chaos as the fight intensified. Fire at the bridge. Clara screamed suddenly. "They're trying to put it out." Rosie looked up from her telegraph key to see figures running toward the burning bridge with water buckets, trying to save enough of the structure to allow passage. If they succeeded, Spade's reinforcements could cross the canyon and completely overwhelm the ranch's defenses. "Can't reach them from here," Moses called back. "Range is too long for accurate fire." Graham's voice carried a note of desperate determination. "I can reach them. Cover me." Before anyone could protest, he was moving sliding down from the barn loft and sprinting toward the corral where the horses milled in frightened confusion. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet as Spade's riflemen tried to cut him down, but Graham moved with the fluid grace of a cavalry officer under fire. "He's going for Thunder," Clara breathed, recognizing her brother's intention. The big stallion was the fastest horse on the ranch, but also the most unpredictable, a half-broken animal that only Graham could handle with any confidence. Rosie abandoned her telegraph key and grabbed a rifle, adding her fire to the covering barrage that Moses and Clara were laying down. Her marksmanship was poor compared to the others, but every shot helped keep the attackers' heads down while Graham worked to saddle the panicked stallion. The bridge fires were spreading despite the efforts to contain them, but enough of the structure remained intact to allow careful passage. If Spade's reinforcements crossed before Graham could stop them, the battle would be over in minutes. "Go!" Moses shouted as Graham swung into the saddle. "We'll hold them here." Thunder reared and plunged as bullets whistled around them, but Graham's firm hands and steady voice brought the animal under control. Horse and rider moved as one as they charged toward the burning bridge, racing against time and enemy fire to prevent a disaster that would doom everyone they loved. The half-broken stallion screamed as flames licked at its hooves, but Graham drove Thunder forward across the burning bridge with the desperate courage of a man who had nothing left to lose. The wooden planking groaned and shifted beneath them, weakened timbers threatening to give way at any moment, while bullets from Spade's riflemen whistled through the smoke-filled air around them not below in the ranch house. Rosie abandoned all pretense of cover as she frantically rewired the fallen telegraph lines, her hands bleeding from the rough metal as she spliced connections under fire. The jamming had stopped, probably because the military equipment operator had been forced to take cover, and she could hear faint signals from the outside world trying to break through the interference. "Clara!" Moses shouted from his position. "At the front window, they're flanking us from the east." Clara swung her rifle toward the new threat, her shots precise despite her youth and the chaos surrounding them. "I see them. 6 riders, maybe 7. But even as she fired, more attackers peered from the west, and Rosie realized with growing horror that they were being systematically surrounded. Spade had committed everything to this assault, probably knowing that failure here would mean the end of his entire conspiracy. Through the kitchen window, she could see Graham and Thunder racing across the burning bridge, flames rising around them like the gates of hell. The stallion's coat was singed and smoking, but the animal's wild courage matched its rider's determination as they charged toward the demolition team, trying to save the crossing. "Got contact," Rosie shouted over the gunfire, her telegraph key finally connecting to the outside world. Territorial Marshal responding, says federal troops are en route from Fort Robinson. "How long?" Moses called back, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. 2 hours, maybe 3. The response brought both hope and despair. Help was coming, but they had to survive long enough for it to arrive. Graham reached the far side of the bridge, just as the demolition team realized their danger. The men scattered, but Graham's cavalry saber flashed in the morning sun as he rode them down with ruthless efficiency. Thunder reared and struck with iron-shod hooves, while Graham's blade found its targets with lethal precision. "The bridge is clear," Clara shouted, watching her brother's desperate charge with fierce pride. He did it, but their celebration was premature. Even as Graham fought to prevent reinforcements from crossing, Spade's main force was advancing on the ranch buildings with renewed intensity. The defenders' ammunition was running low, and gaps were beginning to appear in their defensive fire. Moses grunted as a bullet grazed his shoulder, his return shot dropping an attacker who'd gotten too close to the front porch. "Can't hold them much longer," he warned. "They're too many." Rosie's fingers flew over the telegraph key, sending desperate messages to every homestead in the valley. "Peterson Farm, Henderson Place. Anyone who can hear this, we need help at 7 Cedar, under heavy attack." The responses came back immediately, scattered families throughout the valley, acknowledging her call and promising aid. But they were miles away, scattered across rough terrain, and time was running out fast. "Movement on the ridge," Clara called out, her sharp eyes spotting something. The others had missed. Riders coming from the south. For a terrifying moment, Rosie thought it was more of Spade's forces, the final blow that would overwhelm their defenses completely. Then she heard the distant sound of voices raised in battle cries, familiar voices that made her heart leap with hope. "That's Peterson," Moses shouted, recognizing the call. "And Henderson. The neighbors are coming." The sight of reinforcements racing toward the battle transformed everything. Spade's carefully planned assault began to waver as his men realized they were about to be caught between two forces. Some of the attackers tried to disengage, falling back toward their horses, while others pressed their assault with desperate fury. Graham appeared at the ranch house door, his clothes singed and his face blackened with smoke, but his eyes blazing with triumph. "Bridge is down," he announced. "Their reinforcements are trapped on the far side." Thunder stood behind him, the magnificent stallion's coat marked with burns, but his spirit unbroken. The animal had carried them both through hell and emerged victorious, proving that sometimes wild courage was exactly what the situation required. "They're breaking," Clara shouted, watching as more of Spade's men abandoned the fight. "Look, they're running." The tide of battle had turned decisively. Caught between the ranch's defenders and the arriving neighbors, facing the prospect of federal troops arriving within hours, Spade's forces began a fighting retreat toward the Badlands. Some made it to their horses and fled. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered rather than face certain death. As the gunfire gradually died away, Rosie realized she was still gripping the telegraph key, her knuckles white with strain. Around her, the kitchen was a shambles of broken glass and splintered wood. But they were alive, they were victorious, and the conspiracy that had threatened the entire valley was finally broken. In the distance, smoke still rose from the ruins of the bridge, while the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of their neighbors, farmers and ranchers, who'd risked everything to answer their call for help. The 7 Cedar Ranch had become a symbol of resistance, and that symbol had inspired an entire community to stand together against tyranny. Graham stepped through the doorway, his hand reaching instinctively for Rosie, as if to confirm she was real and safe. Their eyes met across the battle-scarred kitchen, and in that moment, both understood that they'd found something worth more than survival. They'd found each other, and a future worth fighting for. The new wedding ring caught the morning sunlight as Rosie adjusted it on her finger, still marveling at the difference between the simple band of gold and the forged marriage certificate that had once bound her to Eli Spade. This ring represented choice, commitment freely given, and love built on shared trials rather than legal coercion. 6 months had passed since the battle at Seven Cedar Ranch, and the valley had settled into a rhythm of healing and renewal. The burned bridge had been rebuilt stronger than before, with federal funding and proper engineering, while Eli Spade and the surviving members of his conspiracy faced justice in territorial courts. The surveyor's map that had revealed their plans now served as evidence in trials that would reshape Dakota Territory's approach to land development and corporate influence. "Mrs. Calloway," Graham said, testing the name as he joined her on the front porch of their rebuilt home. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Rosie replied, leaning into his warmth as they watched the sunrise paint the distant buttes in familiar shades of amber and gold. "Though I still can't quite believe it's real." The wedding had taken place 3 days earlier in the same kitchen where they'd planned their resistance to Spade's conspiracy. Judge Morrison had traveled from Rapid City specifically to perform the ceremony, bringing with him official pardons for everyone involved in the defense of the valley and federal recognition of their property rights. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had evolved into a legal precedent protecting homesteaders throughout the territory. Clara emerged from the house carrying a tray of coffee and sweet rolls, her auburn hair gleaming in the morning light. At 18 now, she'd grown into a formidable young woman whose courage during the siege had earned respect throughout the territory. Several young men from neighboring ranches had begun paying court, but Clara seemed content to focus on her new role as the valley's unofficial liaison with territorial authorities. "Moses is already up and cooking breakfast for the work crew," she announced, settling beside them on the porch rail. "He says the new barn should be finished by week's end." The reconstruction had been a community effort, with neighbors contributing labor, materials, and expertise to repair the damage from the battle. But more than replacing what was lost, they'd built something stronger, a network of mutual support that connected every family in the valley. The telegraph lines that Rosie had used to call for help now served as a communication system that kept the scattered homesteads in constant contact. "Any word from Marshal Garrett about the trials?" Graham asked. Clara nodded, producing a telegram from her pocket. "Spade was sentenced yesterday 20 years for conspiracy, murder, and federal crimes. Most of his gang received similar sentences, and the territorial officials who supported him are facing federal investigation." "Good," Rosie said simply. "Justice for Margaret's murder, for Billy Henderson's death, for all the families who'd suffered under Spade's reign of terror." It couldn't restore what was lost, but it provided closure and the assurance that such conspiracies would face swift consequences in the future. Moses appeared in the doorway, his military bearing unchanged despite the passage of months and the healing of his shoulder wound. "Breakfast is ready," he announced. "And we've got visitors coming up the road. Looks like the Peterson family." The Petersons had become regular visitors since the siege, their children playing with increasing confidence in the ranch yard while the adults discussed everything from crop rotation to territorial politics. Their presence, like that of other neighbors, had transformed Seven Cedar from an isolated ranch into the heart of a thriving community. "I'll help serve," Rosie offered, but Moses waved her back to her seat. "You rest easy, Mrs. Calloway. You've done enough work for one lifetime." The gentle teasing made Rosie smile. She had indeed been busy, not just with wedding preparations and reconstruction, but with a new project that combined her printing skills with the valley's communication needs. The Seven Cedar Telegraph and Print Shop, housed in a new building adjacent to the ranch house, served as both a business venture and a service to isolated families throughout the region. "A newspaper editor in Rapid City wants to publish your account of the conspiracy," Graham mentioned, pulling a letter from his shirt pocket. "Says it would make an important historical record." Rosie considered the proposal thoughtfully. The story deserved to be told, if only to warn other communities about the dangers of unchecked corporate influence and political corruption. I'll think about it, she decided. But any publication would need to honor the people who stood with us. This was never about one person's heroism. Graham's smile suggested he'd expected exactly that response. In the months since their marriage, he'd learned that Rosie's most defining characteristic wasn't her technical skills or her courage, but her instinctive understanding that individual achievements meant nothing without community support. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the Peterson family's arrival, followed quickly by other neighbors who'd made visiting Seven Cedar part of their weekly routine. Soon the front yard was filled with children playing and adults sharing coffee while discussing the endless details of frontier life. Watching the scene unfold, Rosie marveled at how much had changed since that desperate night when she'd stumbled off the train in her torn wedding dress. She'd been running from a future she couldn't control, seeking nothing more than basic survival. Now she was part of something larger, a community, a family, a life built on daily choices to protect and support each other. No regrets? Graham asked quietly, his hand finding hers as they observed their extended family gathering. None, Rosie replied without hesitation. Well, maybe one small regret. What's that? I wish I could have met Margaret. I think she would have appreciated what we've built here. Graham's fingers tightened around hers, and when he spoke, his voice carried the warmth of healed grief rather than haunting sorrow. She would have loved you, and she would have been proud of what we've accomplished together. As the sun climbed higher over the valley, painting the restored ranch buildings in golden light, Rosie understood that salvation truly wasn't a single act of rescue. It was the stubborn, everyday choice to stand together, to protect what mattered, to build something beautiful from the ashes of destruction. The desperate plea that had brought them together had sparked something far greater than either had imagined, a love strong enough to transform a hunted woman and a grieving cowboy into the guardians of an entire valley's future.